So to pick up where I left off, I was last discussing why literal interpretation of the Bible is wrong, and it's a very long discussion why I really can't go into it here, but I mean, it's blatantly obvious if you have any kind of theological education that the Bible is not to be taken literally, and the Pope, for example, accepts evolution. To move on, again, as far as, what's literal, what's allegorical, and why are there horrible things in the Bible, it's also important before we begin this to preface the discussion by saying, don't quote mine. And that's very important because both sides do it too. For example, Sam Harris at Idea Center did an awful, really shoddily researched talk where the entire preface of the discussion and the entire point that his thing was based on was a quote mine from Luke, in which Jesus is saying, where he said that Jesus said, "Bring any non-believer before me and slay him at my feet." But 2 minutes of just research and reading the chapter before that would demonstrate, no, that's not what Jesus was saying at all. Jesus was telling a parable. It's actually the parable of pounds about a ruler, and it was telling a story. And Sam Harris used that idea and just that basically butchering of the Bible and that horrible quote mine to preface his entire talk, which, again, it really makes you look like an idiot, and it's that amount of just gross negligence and shoddy research is really indicative and can ruin absolutely everything that you say. So be careful not to quote mine. Another commonly quote mine verse is Isaiah 13:16, where it says, "Their infants will be dashed to pieces, and their wives will be ravaged," and things like that. And people often attribute that as God saying that. But no, that's not the case whatsoever. Again, 2 minutes will lead you to find out that that's actually an oracle talking about what will happen to Babylon. It's a prophecy. It has nothing to do with what God is saying, period, or what God is advocating. And in fact, that's actually what does happen to Babylon. The second thing that's important to understand as far as what's allegorical and what's literal is the time between the creation, or not creation, but the creation of what's to be written and when the actual event happened. For example, the Old Testament. Many of those things in tradition, they were just passed down as oral stories. They were passed down orally. They weren't written down for most of the Old Testament for several millennia. And you have to keep in mind exactly what that does. Over a period of time that long, anyone who's ever played telephone will tell you that the story can change quite a bit during that time. The Gospels, on the other hand, which aren't to be taken allegorically, were written or were compiled as early as 10 years after Jesus' death. They were actually compiled into the Gospels, with Matthew being the first as early as 50 AD, I believe. So that's something to keep in mind, too. And when you've got, on one hand, something in the Old Testament being, first passed down by word of mouth for several millennia, then finally being written versus something written 10 years later, there's a big difference there that you need to understand. And that solves and that answers two things, both A, what is literal, and B, why are there horrible things in the Bible. Another thing to understand as far as why the resurrection itself wouldn't be taken allegorically is that the apostles were willing to die for spreading it. Them making sacrifices like that is a pretty subtle hint that it's not to be taken allegorically. The third thing, the fourth thing is, why are there so many horrible things in the Bible? And again, a historical interpretation of the Bible is very important in understanding that. And there are a couple reasons. For one is that our view of God has changed in the past 3,000 years. We know more about God now than we did 3,000 years ago, and I don't think anybody could really argue that. Even if you don't believe God exists, you could still make the case, and it would be rational that if you were entertaining the thought that it did, it's a rational point. And this is evidenced by in the Old Testament and things like that. They used to bring the Ark of the Covenant before battles and things like that, and it was viewed very as, this is God. He's going to protect us. He's going to win this battle for us, and you didn't want to lose the battle because then it's their God beating up your God. So that's something very important to realize as well. That's the old view of God. As time progressed, you can see that completely changing. For example, the Old Testament and all the atrocities that happened there, like sacrifices were the thing to do. Isaiah and the prophets, however, say, no sacrifices, and in the gospel, it's a completely different message, and we understand why. So our understanding of God has changed as well. The third reason why things change over time and why there are horrible things in the Bible is, God said do this, God said do that, is, well, what's often said and what's understood can be two different things. I don't believe personally that God speaks with this, billowing voice from the clouds, and it's very clear. So what could be conveyed and what could be understood and acted upon are two different things. And when you couple all of these things with the fact that it's oral tradition for thousands of years and then finally written down, you can understand why there can be a lot of absurdities. This is actually also why you don't really find any of those things in the New Testament versus the Old. If you take a look, all of these things explain why, in not even the Old Testament, but just the first quarter of the Old Testament is where all of these absurdities and atrocities are. As you go on, you can see a direct correlation between the time and the age of the book versus how many atrocities and absurdities there are. There are a lot in the first half of the Old Testament, not so much in the second half, virtually none whatsoever in the prophets, and then in the Gospels there's none whatsoever. So that's important to understand also, and again, all the reasons that I just talked about are valuable in explaining exactly why that is. Moving on to a different subject, hell. Do I believe in a hell? Yeah. Do I believe there's anybody there? No. Do I believe in a fiery brimstone sort of hell? No, I simply believe that hell is separation from God. This is one area in which I differ from most Christians, although personally I was surprised to find that it's not out of teaching of Catholicism. In fact, many Catholic scholars actually believe this in the sense of, I believe personally that you have the opportunity to accept Jesus and God after death. I believe that there's physical death and then spiritual death, and I believe that at the final judgment we will get a chance, we'll be revealed the truth, we'll be looking back in our lives and things like that and standing before Jesus, and we'll have another chance to, or we'll have the opportunity to either A, still deny that he exists and be separated from God, or we can accept that what Jesus is and go on and pay for what we've done and then move on into, I don't want to say heaven, but whatever you view that place where you may find that small measure of peace. And again, I was actually kind of surprised that that's not really contradicted by church teaching. I'm not really any denomination, by the way. I'm not Catholic, not Protestant, just so you guys know. I believe that the message of the Gospels is one of mercy. I don't believe in a God who's trying to trick you. I don't believe in a God who's setting impossible rules for you to follow. Mercy is a message repeatedly throughout the Bible, or throughout the New Testament, and I think that that's very important to understand, and that is what I believe if you read the Bible with the open mind, the overall message. Understand that this also solves the problem of, is John Lennon or Gandhi, wonderful people, are they in hell? No, I don't believe they are. This also explains, again, independently, why, or it solves the problem of, what about these people on these remote desert islands? Do they go to hell? I mean, they've never even heard the word of Jesus or the name of Jesus. Which brings me to the next point. Why Jesus? Now, over the past couple months, I've really done a lot of soul searching. I've spent a lot of time on atheist and agnostic websites, looking at the arguments and seeing, why do I believe in Jesus? Why not Zeus or Apollo or anything like that? And that's a very good question, and one that I seriously entertained, and I think that I grew a lot as a person trying to answer. But I do have several answers. Let me start, though, by saying that I have the attitude of reality, regardless of how cruel, and I forget where this is a quote from, but it's better to embrace reality, regardless of how cruel, than persist in a delusion, regardless of how tingly and warm it makes us feel. And let me start by saying Christianity does not give me the warm fuzzies whatsoever. So that's nothing with my motivation. But why do I believe in Jesus? One is that the apostles died for what they believed. And they directly knew Jesus. And there are a couple reasons for this, or a couple possibilities as to why they would do that. One would be that they were lying, but that's not really probable, simply because most people aren't willing to die for something that they know is a lie. They could simply be delusional, which I would discount based on a couple things, one of which being 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 6 through 8, in which Paul's talking to people, describing that many people have independently seen Jesus up and around after the resurrection. And he's talking about one instance where Jesus appeared to over 500 people, and he's basically saying, look, if you don't believe in the resurrection, he appeared to 500 people among the apostles and other things at one period. Many of them are still alive. Go ask them. He even says that as kind of an attitude about it. Another reason why I believe in Jesus is based on personal experiences and, again, subjective evidence. But lastly, I believe in Jesus because if you live your life truly according to the Gospels, two things will happen. One, you'll be a happier person, and two, the world will be a better place. If you listen to the Gospels and all the great messages there, you will be happier, and again, the world will be a much better place. And because I believe that no other religion offers that way of life, and Jesus is the teacher of that way of life, that's exactly why I'm a Christian and believe in Jesus.